I've seen a lot of talk recently about mysticism and the problems that it produces, and how it is also counter to the Enlightenment. And what I would say is, because I've heard this too, that Jung is a mystic, classic claim, that Jung is a mystic, and that going into Jungian sort of beliefs and views will inevitably produce some kind of non-democratic governmental system. So what I would like to say here is that one of the things that Jung is trying to do is he's trying to distinguish the subjective from the objective, which is to say, we constantly project facts of our mind onto the world. And then when we build a politics based on that projection, that's when we get these insane, nutty social movements. So for instance, the Nazis were projecting, Jung would say specifically Wotan, that German god. Maybe that's too specific. I'm not saying Jung is some kind of, perfect, perfect seer, prophet. But there is something to that, where whatever it is, the Nazis were projecting some kind of thing in their minds, like some social, not social, but some psychological fact that seemed natural to them. And the reasoning goes something like this. We had democracy. We tried it. But democracy was based as a solution on a certain set of social facts, socially relevant and politically relevant facts. And for those facts, democracy was great. But here's how the thinking goes. But we have now discovered a new set of socially and politically relevant facts. And so democracy is insufficient. We must create a new system. And every time this happens, the whole history of politics is repeated in these theories. So for the Nazis, they discovered something about, they discovered a new politically relevant fact, which of course for them was the supremacy of the Aryan race. Now, their belief was of course literally false. They had a mythical version of Aryan history, and they believed that the Aryan people were able to give. They believed that the Aryan people were the generators of society. So they're essentially like the real humans that turn ape-like, animal-like humans into civilized humans. And once they discovered this new fact, they had to build a new political system which could account for it. So for them, they say, aha, well, if it is true that the Aryans are the source of all civilization, then we must protect the Aryan race at all costs. Do you see? And what they end up doing is they build fascism, some ancient style of government. And so I think really the solution to this problem is just to recognize that we're projecting these psychological facts onto the external world and building a politics based on them. So with Jung, he is constantly insisting that these things are not true of the external world, they are true only of the human psyche. And what I would say is that if you're going to take that, if you're going to think about politics in the context of Jung, you must be agonizingly hesitant to make political inferences from Jungian psychology. I would say it's best to just never do it. Just treat them as separate realms, because you are so likely to project a psychological notion onto the external world. As soon as you start trying to create a politics to account for the new facts of psychology, this becomes almost exactly the same problem that the pre-psychological people had, like the Nazis and the communists, where they mistake some psychological fact for an external fact. So the Hegelian, Marxian, communist view that the world is this developing process, which comes actually from German pietism, Meister Eckhart, and others as well. But this view that God is developing and that we're all part of God, and that there is this sort of omega point at the end when God becomes manifest. and that we can somehow contribute to this process, or that we can act in accordance with this process, and that that's the true path of life. I would say that this is true psychologically, not politically. Or in other words, it's true subjectively and not objectively. So if you read Meister Eckhart, I haven't read him myself, but I've heard about him. But these sorts of religious notions about experience, they're sort of monastic in the sense that they ought to be shut up in the cloister. They read these little books, and then they do their prayer and their meditation, and they have their experience, and they write down some sermons so that we can all get the benefit of them. But they aren't political. To turn the monastic tradition into a political process is just foolish. It certainly should not be political. And this is the problem that continues to happen. So with Jung, what he is trying to say is all these tendencies towards mysticism and Gnosticism and alchemical thinking, astrological thinking, all of these things can't be denied because they constantly emerge unbeckoned from the human psyche. However, we can't build a politics from them because we inevitably mistake them for reality. So if we try to build a politics out of these psychological facts, what we end up doing is we forget that they're psychological facts, and we start to imagine that they are objective facts about the world outside of our psyche. And this is a serious problem. It's always going to lead to nonsense, extremely dangerous nonsense. But that being said, we still need to investigate them. We can't get under this problem of projection without investigating the psyche. And this is where I think things get a little bit strange because, personally I do share this view that we ought to maintain the Enlightenment view of politics, which is to protect individual liberty. That's a very good idea. But we are going to be victim to these psychological tendencies to just come out. And they find their way into the world unless we can become aware of them. Jung says something like, if you don't make the unconscious conscious, then it will play itself out in the world as fate. Something along those lines. Basically, if you don't become aware of your own psychic facts, then you don't notice that they're psychological. You think that they are in the world. So, for instance, if I'm fighting with someone and I think I hate them with all my heart and I think they're evil, I might think that if I kill them, I will actually vanquish evil. But, in fact, even if I do kill them, evil will still exist because evil is a category in my mind. Evil is just a fact of my own psyche. So I can't vanquish evil by vanquishing this guy. And so that is the problem that we constantly run into. And I wonder what the solution is going to be in this particular age. Because there was a time when, at that first flush of the Enlightenment, when you had the political theories of Locke and the American founding fathers, and then people later like John Stuart Mill, the promise of liberty in itself was enough. So the actual political mission of liberty was great. But you see, since we've achieved that to a fairly significant degree now, I think people have just lost their love for liberty. They don't care so much. And there are certain people who still do. They're still very impassioned by individual liberty. But they're few and far in between. And so I think as a more practical solution, we can't simply deny this whole realm of mysticism. We just have to bracket it off from politics. And the only real way of doing that, I believe, is to recognize it as being psychological. So that when anyone comes along with some mystical belief, you don't say, that doesn't fit into my Enlightenment, empiricist, democratic view of society and philosophy. go away. We can't say that because it's just going to keep, it's like whack-a-mole. It's going to keep coming back up. So this is the problem. A lot of these Enlightenment guys, they think what we're going to have to keep doing forever is just constantly vanquish, constantly beat and destroy these mystical freaks. Because they're constantly going to show up. It's a human tendency they acknowledge. But we have no solution to them. All we can do is wait till one comes along and threatens the Enlightenment, empiricist, liberty system, and then destroy them. And then wait, and then they'll come back, and then we destroy them again. That's what we have to do. We have to learn to recognize them so we can destroy them. I actually don't think that's viable. It's just so unstable. And also because the further we get from that first flush of Enlightenment, liberal values, the less potent those values become in themselves. So we just become even more we become even more receptive, or we can be much more easily victimized by this problem of mysticism. So what I would say is that to recognize it as being psychologically valid, but not objectively valid, that puts them in their place. It's not just a total denial. We don't have to deny this constantly re-emerging fact of human nature. But we don't have to deny it, and we can understand it if we treat it as psychological, and then we can also recognize it. So do you see, it's much more powerful, I think, if a mystical religion or a mystical political movement shows up. If we all have the wherewithal and the knowledge to say, yes, I'm sure there is something very true in your movement. However, it is true of your own minds. It is true of psychology. That, I think, is much more powerful than just a pure intolerant liberalism. To just say anything mystical is off the table. Because then, you see, then people have to choose whether they would rather the mysticism or the liberalism. Whereas if we make a psychological theory out of it, then you don't have to choose, because the liberalism can actually absorb everything useful in the mysticism. It can say, yes, thank you for presenting us with new psychological facts. We will attempt to deal with them. But of course, we'll be agonizingly humble about applying them to a political situation. And that's going to really pull the feet out from underneath all these crazy mystical movements. So in more practical terms, if you think about the Nazis and the communists, and now we have Christian nationalists, ethno-nationalists, and also obviously this whole woke thing. All these people are kind of mystics. You know, they believe in mystical views of reality. And they're now having to fight with the modern liberal type people are trying to fight them off as saying, oh, well, you're mystical, so you don't fit. I think it would be much more potent to say, there is certainly something legitimate inside of your mystical belief system. Mr. Communist, Mr. Nazi, Mr. Woke. However, we already know about this. You aren't new. We don't have to choose between liberalism and mysticism. We choose liberalism, but we acknowledge these mystical things. We just aren't going to make a politics out of it. That's not how we're going to address these facts. Only through an individual, personal, psychological exploration of those facts can they be included in a functioning polity. So that's what it is. Because people will be convinced, people will be drawn into the mystical. That's how we are as humans. We have these strange imagination and value. We have a powerful imagination, and if we have to choose between the mundane liberal world and then the highly potent mystical world, then we're going to choose, many of us, the mystical world. But I don't think that liberalism has to be incompatible with that mystical, imaginative world. It just has to use psychology. And that's really where Jung fits in. Jung makes mysticism individual and psychological. so that it can be included in a modern, enlightened, liberal world. And we need more Jung. This is why he's vital. We aren't going to win by just destroying the mystics. It's impossible. But if we can acknowledge the experiences, we can acknowledge the psychological facts underlying mysticism, while also repudiating the political nonsense, then I think that's the only way forward, really. I think we're stuck between a rock and a hard place, and that's the only way out.